Great. Okay. So I'd like to start with the land acknowledgement and start by acknowledging that UBC's Vancouver Point Grey campus is situated on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. UBC's Okanagan campus is situated on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Syilx Okanagan Nation. The land that UBC is situated on has always been a place of learning for the Indigenous people for millennia. And as we gather to learn today, I encourage everyone to think about the relationship to the land or territory that you are situated on, wherever that may be. So I'm very excited to be moderating this panel today. When the Advising Pro-D Program Advisory Group first met was back in December, and the idea and the topic of a session on boundaries came up very, very quickly. And really a strong consensus among the group that maintaining healthy boundaries is really a foundational skill that all advisors need to know and want to know. And yet we often take for granted that we and others simply just know how to do it without ever really getting formally trained. And in reality, setting and maintaining healthy boundaries is not sort of an instinct that we're born with, but it's a skill that we develop over time. And particularly over this past year with COVID, when our normal practices of interacting with students were changed, advisors have been confronted with new questions and challenges around how to set and maintain healthy boundaries. So today I have the honor of interviewing 4 of your advising colleagues who will be the panelists today about how they maintain healthy boundaries in their work. In a moment, I'll ask them to introduce themselves, but just to get some sort of housekeeping items out of the way, we'll interview for the first hour. We have some prepared questions that we will ask them. Probably the best view for everyone would be speaker view. We've spotlighted the panelists, so you should be able to see the panelists at the center of your screen. At the 1 hour mark, we're going to shift to your questions via the chat, and we'll then have the panelists respond to your questions. Talal Elvis, Talal, I don't know if you can wave. Talal is monitoring the chat today. She's an associate director with the VP Students Office. She'll be monitoring it, and you're welcome to enter comments, questions at any time throughout the session. And then Talal will sort of be gathering up the questions for the last half hour of today's session. And we'll work through as many of the questions as we can. All right, so without further ado, I'm going to start by asking each of our panelists to introduce themselves and their role. Tell us a bit about the students that you are working and supporting, and what is sort of unique about the students that you are working with around the topic of setting healthy boundaries. So I'm going to kick it off first to Adam.
Hi, everyone. I'm really happy to be here today with colleagues and presenting to colleagues. I am an academic advisor in the Faculty of Science. And as an academic advisor, my primary role is to provide basically accurate academic advice to students and ensuring that they know the faculty and university regulations at UBC. As an academic advisor, sometimes we have to uphold policy that disappoints students. Other times we help students work around policy in cases where they're going through really extenuating circumstances and where an appeal might be needed. We are positioned between students and the various dean's offices that we work with. So not quite advocates, but kind of at this intersection of working with students, but also with faculties in the university. What's really unique about my role is that we do focus on academics, and I come to my work with an understanding that academics is really central to the students' experience at UBC. If they fail out of their program, they're not involved, they can't get involved with clubs, research, any sorts of other on-campus involvement. So with coming from my perspective, I see academics as absolutely central to their time at UBC and their degree. Yeah, I'm excited to be here today. I'm definitely not an expert on boundaries. I definitely struggle with boundaries in different areas of my life, sometimes with coworkers. Don't even get me started with boundaries with my elderly mother. But when it comes to students, I have kind of found this sweet spot in my life where I don't stress about student cases. I don't go to bed at night worrying about students. I don't I don't panic about how my boundaries are set with students. So hopefully I can share some experiences that have helped me along the way today. And I will pass it back to Carol.
Oh, sure. Jolie, do you want to take it next? Oh, you're muted.
Number one, presenting at a Zoom room. Hi, everyone. My name is Jolie Ellison. I'm an accessibility advisor in the Center for Accessibility. We work with students who have permanent disabilities or ongoing medical conditions that impact their academics. So slightly different than a faculty advisor is that our focus isn't necessarily only on academics. It really is on the whole person and the intersections of a person's life as well. So we look at students' medical documentation, and then we're able to assess what academic accommodations and what types of concessions are available to a student. Also, our work is informed by, the human rights legislation in BC, and also by policy LR7 within the university. So one of the, I think, bigger challenges that we face in our office is that we are working with all students across the university. So every program, every faculty, graduate, undergraduate, students who are in professional programs, students who are, perhaps at one of the colleges, like Corpus Christi. So a real variety of students at the university, students who are also dealing with like every different type of disability you could imagine, or combinations of those disabilities. So it's a real wide variety of students that we're dealing with, and then we're dealing with all of the different faculties as well. So that's one of the sort of major challenges, I would say, that we face in terms of boundaries and setting boundaries, because we are often shifting our boundaries depending on the student we're working with, depending on the faculty, depending on the program they're in. So really understanding our role, but understanding our role might be different depending on. So I think that's, that's one of the biggest challenges we face. I also work very closely with many Indigenous students. We have an Indigenous strategic or Indigenous student initiative in our office where we try to reduce the barriers that Indigenous students face in accessing our services. So I work quite closely with a number of the Indigenous students who are registered in our office. Okay, pass it back to you, Carol.
All right, thanks, Jolie. Chris, do you want to go next?
Yeah, definitely. Hi, everyone. My name is Chris Rambaran. I work in enrollment services, in student support and advising. And we all have different, in enrollment services, we all have different portfolios and programs we lead, or demographics of students. And my focus is on students that have lived experience in the government care system. And, it's broadly expanded to focusing on their recruitment, retention, and some of the campus connectedness of these students. So I manage, a bulk of my work is managing the tuition funding programs, awards management. So there's a heavy focus on financial advising, but it's unique in that I'm made up of the wraparound supports that are, especially needed for these students. So I'm involved during the entire student life cycle, every step of the way, from application, admission, and enrollment as they navigate their time here at UBC. I'm also on the Indigenous student support team. And I'd say some of the challenges in navigating boundaries is what's unique about my students is they're by definition not having access to family support or a support system. And in some ways, my role is to compensate for that, or to bridge some of those gaps. And I have a background in child services. So I was a child protection worker and guardianship, which meant that I was the legal guardian for youth in the foster care system. So my work has really been trying to let go of some of the loose boundaries that I used to have, and exercise some more boundaries in this role, because the students are older, and it's a part of developing their own agency too, and modeling boundaries, because I think that boundaries are learned. Anyway, that's more on that after in our questions. So yeah, I'll pass it back. I'll pass it to Carol. Thanks.
Spoiler alert. Okay, Sarah, last but not least.
Hi, everybody. I'm Sarah Cameron. I work with the MasterCard Foundation Scholars Program, as well as the WUSC Scholars Program. For some background, MasterCard Scholars are exceptional students coming from Africa. And accessing wraparound support, sort of similar to what Chris was talking about. So really supporting students from the day that they arrive through to graduation. And as the program advisor, I really look at holistic picture. So looking a lot at well-being, at academics, at finances, and helping students to navigate the systems. The other half of my job is I work with the WUSC Scholars Program. So WUSC is a student refugee program. So it's a group of UBC students who are actually legally sponsoring and supporting the resettlement of refugees each year. So I really oversee the administrative function of that, as well as the day-to-day advising. So that is supporting resettlement. So UBC as a place where people are building a home, really transitioning to life in Canada. These are students who are not returning to their home country for summers or and are not resettling with family. So I think similar to what Chris was talking about, sort of taking a role within that larger support system, but also not being a family member. Boundaries, I will say a colleague, when I told her that I was doing this panel, laughed quite a lot. So boundaries are something I think about a lot, not always something I'm strong at. So I'm excited for this discussion.
Great. Thank you so much. Okay, so we'll get started with the first question. Actually, I'm going to change it up just a little bit. I think you have all spoken a little bit about why the particular students that you work with, boundaries are so important. If you want to say more about that, panelists, please do. But I thought we would more jump into the second question, which is really around the black and white of boundaries. Is there any black and white around how advisors should set boundaries? And what kind of boundaries are non-negotiable, in your opinion? So I'm going to throw this out to Chris first, and then Chris, you don't have to pass it back to me each time. You can just sort of pass it to each other.
Yeah, so for me, it's a yes and no. Boundaries are always contextual. I mean, there are hard no's, definitely, but I think hard no's can become soft no's, So what might be a strong hard no in the city, in Vancouver, might be okay in like a rural community. Because I've seen that in different fields of practice too, where you might not go to a student's wedding in Vancouver, it might not be appropriate, but in a small town, that might be totally the norm. So I think that social norms play a big role in what our boundaries are. So roles and norms and boundaries are definitely cultural in that way. But I would say that there's no black and white. They're all gray. They're all gray, I think. And one thing that I've found helpful is having an ethical framework to help me make decisions. So I might go down a list. I might think of, okay, does it respect their dignity? Is it in their best interest? Is there a conflict where I'm getting some personal benefit? Is it at integrity with my professional duties and obligations? And if it ticks off all the box, it becomes a little bit more black and white, but often it doesn't tick off all the box. And sometimes one or more of those things are at odds. And that's where you have an ethical dilemma. And sometimes I like to think if it's a really complex situation, I like to pretend, well, if I'm going to break one ethic over another, or an ethic might trump a policy at UBC, I really better be able to explain myself as if I was going to explain it to a board of ethics or something. And that's why I think a boundary for me is to protect myself and document if that's the case, and being able to really define those boundaries and explain myself in that type of situation. So that's just a practice I think is helpful, is defining the boundaries, having an ethical guideline and standard of practice just for ourselves, to protect ourselves.
Right. Who wants to chime in? Jolie?
I agree with what Chris was saying, and really thinking about ethics, right? Like thinking, why am I doing this? Is this a good decision? And how would I explain this to someone? Or even taking the student's perspective. Like if I was the student and I'm asking for this, or somebody is doing this for me, like how would that impact me, or would that be a good thing? Or, how helpful would it actually be? And then also something that Adam, now it slipped my mind, something that Adam mentioned earlier, I was going to talk about. Oh, I remember. Yes, this about like your own personal health. So, if you have good boundaries, well, I always feel if I have good boundaries for myself, then, I'm able to sleep at night. I give good referrals to people. I know the boundaries of my job. Like I'm pretty comfortable understanding what my role is and what my colleagues' roles are. So in referring students to other services across campus, whether it's enrollment services or the faculty advising officer, really understanding what my role is and being able to explain that to a student, I think really helps set students up and myself up to understand what the boundaries are of the role. And then also being able to describe what other people do on campus so that you can give those good referrals, but also, again, creating those good boundaries for students so that they understand where they can go to access services or supports or whatever they need. And it does provide that sense of agency for students, right? Like we're being more respectful, I feel, if we're setting up those good boundaries, we're modeling good boundaries and healthy sort of choices and decision-making processes, and then also providing that student with their own agency and letting them know that we trust them to make, the best decision for themselves at the time. Next, Sarah.
If I could jump in there, I also, that really resonates with me because I think it's so important to understand that there's a lot of confusion among students. They see everyone in the Zoom room as the same advisor, come counselor, come advocate. They don't understand our roles. And so one gray area where I set boundaries quite often is when students are disclosing about any sort of trauma, past trauma, current trauma. I think a lot of us as advisors, no matter what office we're working for, we're drawn to the work because we're very empathetic and very, very caring. And when we see that train leave the station and the tears flow and the stories come out, there's a fine line between letting students tell you their story. But at a certain point, you have to remind them that maybe you are not a counselor. There might be a better place to go to. If you're allowing them to disclose all of that, sometimes it's with the false assumption that they have that you're going to be able to help them. And so one boundary that I am very careful about is when students open up and start disclosing. I like to just get a little sense of what's going on so I can direct them to the appropriate person on campus. But it's really hard to stop that disclosure midway and find a sweet spot, because you don't want students to lay their heart out if you actually can't help them. So that's a gray area for me, definitely. Another gray area is obviously friendships with students. Really difficult. Personally, I find I can't maintain friendships with students because there is a power structure associated with my role where we have to uphold rules and policies and things that make it difficult to be friends with students. I don't know about other people on the panel.
Sarah, did you want to chime in there?
Yeah, I think that friendship point is a good one, Adam. I think as a program advisor, to be honest, the boundaries of my role are pretty fluid in lots of ways, and they may evolve over time. So the idea of a black and white boundary, I don't know that I have that. I mean, I won't go into a student's home or have them into my home, but I mean, those types of lines, but, will I sit in the hospital with a student? Yeah, for sure. Or, take calls outside of work hours when there's an emergency. Yeah. I wouldn't have done that in different roles that I've had. But I think that line, Adam, that you mentioned about friendship to me really resonates, because I think that that's when those relationships can get foggy for the student, right? Is in our programs, I think often the students would identify as feeling like family, right, amongst each other. And I have vocally had to sort of say, like, no, I'm not your mom, I'm not your sister, I'm not a member of your family. And I think navigating that feeling for a student, especially who maybe doesn't have a broader support system yet, of how do we navigate when we feel like family to them and they don't feel like family to us, or friends, or all of those things. And that to me is kind of my line usually, is there maybe too much emotional reliance, right? I think to me, that's my hard line. And I think my other one is, I think as people were talking a lot around referring students out and doing things like that, which is there somebody who is better able to do this? And how do I support you in getting to that service versus fobbing you off or making you feel like you're kind of left behind because that's not my job, versus explaining why that person is better suited, right? So when there's support, accessing the support.
Great. Anyone else want to chime in on anything there?
Yeah, definitely. The example of having to drive a student, I think some of it is your own discretion as well. So one of the first questions I might ask is, well, how immediate is it to drive this student? And the second is, do they have access to anyone else that can drive them apart from myself? Because that might be stretching my role. And then, I might go down the list of other things of, well, are they a minor? Because if they're a minor, then I definitely need some guardianship consent. And then, am I protected? Do I have the adequate insurance to if something were to happen? So these are some of the things that I might consider. And every situation is different, of course. And I know the pandemic itself has, created so many grave situations for us. At the beginning of it, I had one student that had to be quarantined in campus housing and had nobody to drop off her groceries, and she couldn't leave the unit. And there wasn't that infrastructure in place to ensure that she had food. So in that case, I did work out of core hours to drop off groceries. Of course, my boundary with the institution was I was reimbursed for that. I did count it as time because I can work a flexible schedule. So I feel totally just in integrity with that decision because it was immediate. I think it was within my role for sure. And I was supported by the institution to do that. So there was no odds. I didn't feel misaligned in that at all.
Great. I think what I've been struck by in our sort of pre-conversations for this panel is how different your roles are as advisors, and how that often is one of the first things you think about as you kind of go through that criteria is, what is my role as an advisor? What other supports does the student have? What's sort of normal or what's expected in the unit that I work in and the type of students I support? And I think that also leads to why for the advising across the campus to say that there is one black and one white. I probably naively thought before I spoke with all of you that there should be. And there probably are some, right? Of course, as Sarah said, I'm not going to invite them into my home and things like that. But there's probably not as many black and whites as we would like to think. Okay, so next question. For students from marginalized and equity-seeking populations, what else do advisors need to be thinking about and taking into consideration in the quest to set and maintain healthy boundaries? I'll just let whoever wants to go first on that. Jolie?
Sure, I can go first. Yeah, I always think for myself, when I'm thinking about students who are in equity-seeking communities or from equity-seeking communities, like it's so personal for me because, I am First Nations, I'm Kwagu, and that's really how I identify with. And when I first came to UBC, straight out of high school, as a first-generation student, and it was very, very difficult for me. And so when I meet students who are Indigenous and they're first generation, I really do connect with them, and I empathize with them, and I want them to be successful. So I really want them to succeed. So I have to be careful in thinking like, is this, sort of managing my own expectations or what I can do for a student, or, what's best for the student as opposed to like what I think is best for a student or what I think would be helpful. So sort of really understanding where I'm coming from and understand my own personal experience and how that impacts my advising and how that impacts the relationship I have with other students who are from equity seeking communities. Yeah. So especially like, yeah, students who are struggling with finances, first generation Indigenous, other equity seeking students. I feel like I could identify in those situations. So really recognizing my own personal bias, well, not necessarily bias, but how I'm impacted by working with those students. And it makes me, probably makes me better at my job in some ways, but also really, impacts those relationships at times. So just being careful of that.
Sarah?
That's such a nice point. I think that positionality is really important. As a white woman, I'm working with students whose identity I don't share and pathways I don't share. And I think that for me, it feels really important to remember that my experience of the institution or of post-secondary is likely, it's factually vastly different, but I think that also seeing the institution for what it is and for its shortfalls. And I think I really do identify that part of my role is advocacy and allyship and really trying to think about what are students telling me that they're experiencing, what are colleagues telling me that students are experiencing or that they're experiencing, what's happening in classrooms, and then where is my space to challenge and to use my position and my privilege to challenge that and seeing that as a necessary part of this role. And so I think that trying to dig deeper and trying to reshape our institution in support of these students and to support students as they're reshaping our institution feels really critical as we build trust and we build these relationships and advise. Thanks.
In my work, at the moment, I don't work with a particular subset of students that are from any of these populations, but in a different way, working with first generation students. And I've never really loved the term first generation, because what it really to me implies is students that come to university without the same levels of social or economic capital. And it resonates with me a lot because I came to UBC and right away I can smell the privilege. I was in classrooms with people that had judges for parents and sisters who did PhDs, and I was coming from a working class background, and literally I did not know what was going on. And we often tell students that when you get to UBC, you'll feel like you're a fish out, or you're a small fish in a big pond, and you're coming from high school where you're a big fish in a small pond. And usually that we try to normalize the experience for them academically, that it's going to be hard and you might not do well, but nobody really addresses the fact that for a lot of students, it's going to be a shocker, whether they're coming from Burnaby or New Delhi. Sometimes the different groups that they're exposed to on campus can make them feel very, very small. And I think as advisors from across campus, it's very important for us to not let students feel small. And I often cross my own boundaries when I feel like a student needs that level of support. I'll go out of my way to explain things to them because I'm so passionate about trying to help them and get them to understand the system that they've just entered. So in that case, I feel that's an area where we could do better in helping these students that come from first generation students from different kind of backgrounds, and they come from all sorts of, marginalized equity seeking groups across the board. I'll throw it back to the panel, though that's just my.
Sure. Chris, did you want to chime in at all?
Sure, yes. Having shared experience with many of the students I work with, I definitely need to keep in check and make sure I'm not imposing my own experiences on them. So that's definitely something that is part of that self-awareness. I'm hearing like an overall theme of how self-awareness is so important in our advising. But a wise person once said, and I think this is universal for all students, that you want to meet people where they're at, but also show up as you are. being authentic, being genuine, being sincere, and transparent about your limitations, that I will go above and beyond to help you and support you. But yeah, I am not, I have within my own limitations and boundaries, and trying to contract that as much as possible from the beginning is important to not, create any disappointment or misleads into our role, which is something that is definitely a work in progress for myself, because I do want to go above and beyond, but I also know that I'm human, I need sleep, I need breaks, I need all of those things, just like all of us. But one thing that I found that I've been contemplating is what values I bring in my advising. So, there's definitely ethical values, but there's personal values. And one of them might be being liked and being approved of and accepted. And if I'm valuing being liked, then I might tell a student what they want to hear and not what they need to hear. And, and a colleague of mine shared that vulnerability, and that really sort of brought that into my awareness of, am I leaving that meeting with a student ensuring that they heard what they needed to hear, not just what they wanted to hear or what I wanted to share with them. So that's always something to navigate. Are we, what sort of culture, like what's our baggage that we're bringing in to these interactions? And that's why that self-awareness is so important.
Great. Yeah, it kind of gets into the next question of what does interfere with our ability to set healthy boundaries with students, and just what you mentioned, that need to be liked, to actually want to be delivering the good news, not the bad news. Are there other things that get in your way sometimes, anyone on the panel, from setting healthy boundaries?
I can sum it up with one word: assumptions. It's all about assumptions and boundaries. I think of boundaries like expectations. Boundaries are not necessarily always clear to students. They don't know our boundaries, and boundaries can only become expectations once they're clearly communicated to the student. So, for example, I love working with students, what I refer to as frequent flyers, that are at our front counter every second day. Oftentimes those students just don't understand that might not be acceptable. And in order to explain that might not be acceptable, it's important to let them know what our queue is and how many students we're helping and what is a reasonable amount of times to come back for course planning. And what's important is to give them that explanation. Again, not making them feel small, but giving them some insight into the system that they're a part of and how big that queue might be. So when I let them know that we have 10 minutes to go over their course planning for that day, I want them to come away from that appreciating those 10 minutes and appreciating the fact that I told them my boundary for that day.
Thanks. Any others want to chime in? Sarah?
I think that's such a good point, but I think there's another side to that as well, which is, I guess for me, one of the ways that is a quicker road to my boundary is when a system is broken, right? Or when we have an institutional barrier that also requires immediate attention. So, if the system is broken, I likely will cross a boundary and then probably backtrack and try to address the systemic failure, right? But I think that is part of it, is when you're working within a good system, or when you're, when you kind of have a clear cut thing, sometimes that works really well. And then every so often there'll just be a wrench thrown in that you realize when I was an academic advisor, suddenly a student would share a classroom experience and you're like, oh, we're having a very different conversation than I thought we would be having, or there's, wait times, or there's services that just don't support the students that I support, that maybe aren't looking at trauma or PTSD or other features that students may be bringing with them. And so I think, addressing the system is important. And then I think all of the sort of human things of I think that point, Chris, of like wanting to be liked, and you're right, wanting to give the good news and wanting to also help students win, right? I think that often I think that a lot of like, I just want you to win, right? I just want you to be successful and find that and kind of being able to drop it, right? And to say like, oh, I see that maybe this isn't one that you're going to win. And how do we let go, and how do we support somebody in letting go or moving forward when it's more successful without us?
Julie?
Um,
You're muted.
Yeah, I agree with what Sarah's been saying. And also I was thinking about how often UBC says that it has these boundaries and they cannot be passed. And we have all these rules and regulations, and this is the way things are. But actually, I know that anything is possible. And all of these rules and regulations have been challenged, and students have been given different opportunities or different answers or different results, depending on individual situations, right? So I think when you've been you've been working at the university for a while and you've seen different types of scenarios, and then you begin to learn that, oh, actually the boundaries are gray, right? Even the university's own institutional rules and regulations are quite gray and can change. And I think that was portrayed with the whole COVID-19 and the global pandemic. Prior to this, we were told exams cannot be online, exams have to be in person. Classes cannot be in line, degrees cannot be granted if students are taking only online classes. Like all of these types of rules and regulations and protocols have just been thrown to the wind. So when we see that happen so quickly, then we do learn that these rules and regulations or the boundaries are very gray and can change depending on the circumstances very quickly.
I love the point also that Sarah brought up about that systems thinking, that we are working within systems, and some of those systems are broken. And when I think about the deficits in a system, it can lead to frontline workers being frustrated, and in turn, it can lead to students being really frustrated, and they become the targets of that affection, where there's like a lateral violence is how I've heard it phrased. Where people on the front lines will be frustrated with those that they serve, and those that they serve will be frustrated at those that represent those systems. And just being able to separate those two things is really helpful. I know that volume is really high, resources might not be matching the volume that we're seeing, and so we might get angry parents phoning us on the other end, wanting the decisions for their kids of what school they're going to get into. But just knowing that, okay, this is because this is a systemic thing that's out of my control. And, this parent or this student has no idea about those large moving pieces, and not to personalize it, because we're not our institutions. We represent them, but we're not them. And I know that's hard to see outside of that in the moment, but it's a good reminder that we aren't those deficits either. In fact, that we can help them by being aware of them and helping those navigate them. It's kind of like an analogy I've heard before is, if the system is the bear, you have to protect students from the bear, but also feed the bear at the same time. And I feel like that's the line we're always walking at the same time. So, yeah.
Lovely metaphor. It really is. Sorry, and I'm going to veer off script for a moment, but I think that cycle, I keep writing down the word advocate, and I've heard you all talk about this before, that yes, you're seeing a student, but then you realize, oh my goodness, the system is broken. So in addition to helping the student, I also want to poke at the system. I want to go in and I want to advocate. And yet too much of that, and it breaks your boundaries, and you get more tired, and you're working more hours, and you're promising things to the student that you actually can't deliver. And then this is like this cycle. So I don't know what the question is, but how do you stay healthy in both feeding the bear and protecting that student from the bear? Do you have any tricks up your sleeve of when you're doing too much feeding and too much protecting?
One thing that I focus on a lot, and it's always an uphill battle, because I think like Chris, I want students to like me, I want peers to like me, but when a student has come my way after being bounced back and forth from different offices, and I know that the student might have been misadvised, it's very easy to throw that other office under the bus. And right away, you're an ally you're an advocate, and you're on the same level with the student. But you're by doing that, it feels good in the moment. But I think that's an easy way out rather than just trying to get to the root of what might have happened. So I love Jolie's point about, anything is possible at UBC, but I try to be mindful of when I'm communicating with colleagues in other units, there's a difference between emailing them and CCing the student versus chatting with them on the side and exploring possibilities. And in one approach, you're kind of putting their back up against the wall. And in the other, you're working with them. So that's something I think that is difficult, but is really important to do at UBC.
Sure.
Just gonna add really quickly. I think for me, I like that point a lot. I think for me, it's transparency, right? That I don't, and I think I've gotten better at it as my career has gone on, which is I don't need to throw an office under the bus, but I can say to somebody, I don't love that you got that message, or I don't like that for you, right? I think that transparency builds something of saying, like, I see what's happening. Let's think about why did you get that response, or what is happening, and trying to get to the root of it. But I'm not good at compartmentalizing a professional Sarah versus a personal Sarah, or I'm just going to show up as me. And I think that means that sometimes I'm going to say, this is really frustrating for you. Let's figure it out, versus like, that person gave you terrible advice. Now I feel like I feel good about the good advice I'm giving you, right? Because I'm also given bad advice sometimes. And I want to also be able to say to somebody like, that probably wasn't the best move, or let's rethink this thing, right? So I think that at least helps some of the frustration that can come with these barriers or challenges, or when you see that boundary coming up on you and you're just getting ready to put your foot on the other side. And sometimes I just say that of like, I think I'm overstepping.
Yeah, I'll go ahead, Jolie. Okay. To Adam's point as well, I think that kind of feeds into the lateral violence too. If when you're in a deficit-based system, and one unit might make a mistake, and where we might even discharge some of the blame towards other colleagues, or our frustration towards colleagues from cross units. And I think it goes to your point back to Adam when you talked about assumptions. Like, I don't know what's going on for that unit. Maybe I don't understand why they gave that advice, but also I've done that same thing in the past, where I might have thrown another department under the bus. And, I had this manager that told me, well, how long are you going to work with the student? Maybe a couple of years. And they asked me, well, how long are you going to have to work with that department? Well, probably the rest of my career. So that collaboration, they didn't have to spell it out for me. That collaboration is so important. And it's actually important to have that collaboration for the students. We need to be working well together for students too. So that's definitely a tricky dynamic to navigate, though, is having good, healthy, respectful relations with other units, with other departments, so that we can better support students as well. And I think that's a really good philosophy and framework, and always easier said than done too.
Jolie?
Yeah, I was just going to add that, relationship is everything, right? So maintaining those relationships with your students as well as with your colleagues and other programs is so important in this work. And I think it's okay to disagree with people, but doing it in a respectful way. And trying not as much as possible not to throw other programs or, advisors or colleagues under the bus. And I often, students often come to our office to complaining about instructors, other advisors, other programs. Everyone's always given the student the wrong information. That's often the message that comes to our office, because we're often maybe the second or third or fourth person a student has talked to, because that's how the referral process works. Like, we're not an emergency kind of office. Everything can be dealt with after the fact for our students. but yeah, often when students get to us, they've hit those walls, they've been told no, they've maybe given some wrong information or information they just didn't want to hear. So often for us, it is around, just trying to be as authentic as possible. And also saying things like, I often say things like, well, I'm not sure why that advisor gave you that information, but that this is my understanding, or I can follow up with that person to find out more information before I sort of jump to the assumption that the student is really understood what they're being told, first of all, because often students, misunderstand because they often are getting a lot of information at once. And maybe they're not well, for the students that we're seeing, they might not be in the best frame of mind, or not be understanding the information as thoroughly as they could be. But really understanding, relationships are everything. And we often work with faculty members, so faculty members who are very frustrated with students. So really trying to be, as relationship focused as possible while still advocating for the students so that the students' needs are met, or the students getting the most support or the best options available to them at the time.
And I think we can also, to build off that, Jolie, like we can validate the frustration without feeding into the story around that frustration.
Mm. That's good. Okay. So we're going to keep going about 10 more minutes with some more questions for the panelists. I would sort of encourage those of you in the audience, if you have a question that's beginning to burn in your mind, it's not too soon to sort of enter it in the chat, and that will give Talal sort of an opportunity to get a lay of the land in terms of what people are most interested in asking. But I think where you guys were starting to go in this conversation is a little bit around what I like to think of as the tactics. Like, we understand sort of why boundaries are important, what gets in our way, but you've shared some really great, the way you word things, what you actually do and don't do. So the question for you now is, as advisors, you cue students verbally and non-verbally about what is your responsibility versus what's theirs, what kind of support and assistance you can provide, and what you won't, what you expect from them, and so on. And I'm wondering if you could share, tangibly speaking, what some of those cues are that you either put in emails or say or do to reinforce the boundaries with students.
I'd be happy to jump in. And jumping off of Chris's point about the deficit system in which we work, we have a limited amount of time. I always think it's always in the best interest for students to let them know about why your time with them might be limited. So at the moment, for example, we're trying to help a lot of students that are approaching graduation. It's critical that they get the support that they need. But at the same time, in the admissions cycle, we're getting calls from grade 11 students that have a question about a major that they might be pursuing 4 years down the road. So with both of those students, I think it's always important to frame where we're at in the cycle, kind of maybe encourage them to come back at a different time, not because they're an inconvenience to you at that moment, but maybe letting them know, reframing it and telling them that I will have more time to speak with you in 2 weeks' time. Let's schedule an appointment. So trying to be strategic and always explaining why you're making the suggestion you're making so they don't feel like they're being bounced around. I think that's really fair and yeah, definitely very fair.
Great. Others?
Go. I think I have kind of two things. I think one is similar to Adam's point of helping to manage some expectations. So I think that if I'm drawing a line, I try to explain why I am, right? So whether it's that this is crossing into something that feels too personal or too much time or whatever that is, trying to explain why I'm making that decision. And I think that also trying to help a student as we're navigating to understand why and where they may be getting better support and how to approach it. So that's usually a coaching conversation. To be honest, I think it is shifting a relationship that could easily become reliant into one that is empowering, I hope. I have another really tangible one that I do, which is for our WUSC students, and this is I mean, probably different than most people's experience other than these award programs, which is when these students arrive, they arrive on their own. And that's it, right? And we have a responsibility around their resettlement needs and pieces like that. And so when somebody arrives, they may just know me and maybe one or two other students, right? And so students have my cell phone number. They can call me, they can text me. We had students in quarantine during their resettlement this year. And so it was a lot of late night calls and things like that, which, make me feel dread, but also feel like, well, I think I need to do this for a few weeks. But what I've developed over the years is kind of these moments where I actually say, okay, so you all have my phone number. Now you're going to stop using it, right? Like, here's how we're going to start communicating, right? So we're no longer in a call or text anytime because you don't know the lay of the land at all, right? Versus, okay, so the easiest way to get me now is by email. I, stop responding to texts that come after 4 o'clock or 5 o'clock or whatever that is, right? So I think that initially I just would do it and expect that people would come along with me. And I think I've learned more to be explicit in all of my communications of saying, this is why we're doing this. Here's what this mode of communication is appropriate for, and here's what it's not, right? So I think it goes back to a point I think Chris made earlier of, am I the right person to be doing this? Or do you have another way to get this support or this service or to do this task?
Oh yeah, that was Adam that mentioned the right person, right task thing. But yes, building off of that, I think that I too, similar to Sarah, because of the demographic of students that I work with and some of the vulnerabilities and barriers they face, I did advocate for a work cell. It wasn't even advocacy; it was just asking, and I was granted a work cell phone because I did want to keep that separate. And it was sort of an experiment to see how much students would use it. And I just wouldn't answer it over the weekend. I'd check it just in case there was an emergency. Nothing crisis came up. There was no crisis that came up. So never had to really go outside of the hours to address any of those communications. And at the beginning of every year, there is an email that explains the purview of my role and what I'm here for, and that I'm really, I add my own little relational twist to it to make it sound a lot more friendly. That, I want to meet you. I'm always happy to chat. And ideally, I don't always do this, but the ideal, I think, is upon first meeting a student is expressing your style of working and trying to gauge what their style of communication is and what their preferences are. Do they prefer email? Do they prefer text? Do they prefer phoning? And because I'm, in my role, I do have more capacity to do, to have more outreach and more of an outreach centered approach. I ask them, do you prefer if I check in with you every now and then, or do you only want to reach out to me when you need something? And oftentimes they're fine. They want to reach out to me when they need help, but others are like, yeah, sometimes I do get into a state of depression where I can't even answer an email. So checking in would be awesome if you could do that. So I find that's helpful. When you really get to know your students, you can kind of get a sense of who needs that extra poke and that extra check-in. So I think that's where the relationship really comes in, and building that rapport to really just get a sense of, what the needs of students are. It's, of course, like, I think when we're all talking, there's no one size fits all for all of our students that we work with. And even in any group of students, they're all individuals at the end.
Julie?
Yeah, I mean, everything Chris and Sarah have been saying, and Adam, I totally agree with. It's great conversation we're having. During our intakes with our students, I really go over who are your supports, who do you go to in these circumstances? How are you being supported? Where do you live? What's your living circumstance? So we can really explore that. And I have a good understanding, and the student has a good understanding of, what my role is. And then I can also say, and these are where you go in times of need for this situation, for healthcare supports, for your living environment, for financial resources, whatever is going on for you. So you have that really good sort of basis of understanding. And of course, in my role, I do have the privilege of having that enough time to have those conversations with students and to have a real thorough understanding of what their experience is. And if they don't have those supports, if they're not connected, then really, helping the student to identify how they can build those supports or develop those relationships with other services across campus or, in their own community or wherever they may be at. And then being able to really define your role. And I feel like, it is that kind of developmental thing as well in our role where we start off very close and very connected to a student, and a student might email and phone us and have, several meetings with us in the first couple of months that they're registered with our office. But then as you hopefully, as they go through their degree, as they become more comfortable with the services and supports available at UBC, they are connecting with you less on the big picture things and more on, the specific issues that I could really actually help the student with.
So I'm just going to read one of the questions that's come in on the chat because I do think it's a bit relevant to what we're talking about right now, just in terms of like sort of tangible strategies. The question from Halamet Alibi is, what's an example of actual language you would use to gently but firmly stop students from oversharing?
If I could jump in, I can think of recently a student who was sharing a story about a very traumatic experience with assault. And I definitely at no point, I never want to shut down that student. I want to gently let them know that I'm not a counselor. This was a first-year student who could very have well thought that I was a counselor with professional training. But the way I kind of pivoted was just to say, after there's a natural pause, and if the student is weeping, you don't never want to cut them off, but letting them know, hey, student, I actually don't have a counseling background. Being absolutely upfront, and that's not my role, but can I connect you with a counselor today to make sure that you get the help that you need? So not so much stopping them, but letting them know, hey, like I'm actually not the right person. I want to hear you out, but let's just move now to connecting you. I don't know if that makes sense, but
yeah, others. I think we'll have all kinds of different examples, but I think that's great. Anyone else want to share how they word that?
Sure, I can share. It definitely does happen quite often in my role, and even at the beginning when I was shaping my role and creating my role, I thought, is that my role? So I had to ask myself that question. I don't know where that's coming from.
That is odd.
sounds like somebody's selling.
It's funny. Yeah. So yeah, if a student is sharing with me, I like to acknowledge and, commend them, first of all, for sharing and that vulnerability and the trust that they're showing in me. I think that that's definitely something that, that's definitely something that I'm grateful for, that they trust in me. And so I acknowledge that. And I do let them know that, much like Adam, that I am not, I'm not a counselor. That's not my role. I may not. So my ability to maybe help you with the situation is definitely limited. And I might not be the best person to do that. That being said, I also understand it can be really tough to have to retell your story, or maybe you're not looking for counseling, but you just felt in that moment you wanted to share that, and that's fine. You're welcome to do that. But here is counseling. It is there for you, and you're welcome to reach out on your own. Or I can definitely do more of a warm referral or a warm handoff and introduce you to somebody that can help you get more deep into this work.
Great. Others? Sarah?
I don't know that it's possible to overshare in my job. It feels like I kind of have little flavors of lots of things, and I agree so much about honoring the trust that you've built and the relationship, and that feels really significant. I think that the fear that I always have around the concern around oversharing is what's happening in that situation. So what what's happening for you, what's it prompting for yourself. I think I've developed some pretty good skills at least compartmentalizing what people are sharing. And I try to remind them that our conversations are confidential. They're just between us, unless, of course, there's a bigger picture of harm or things like that. But yeah, I think the notion of a warm handoff makes the most sense in this type of experience. And I think that if you really, depending on your role, if it really does feel like, what is happening? Like, I can't take this information in. I think that is a good moment to sort of almost create a pause, right? To remind somebody of what you do and what your function is and what's available to them as a student. But I think that sometimes once that sharing starts, it's there, right? And sometimes I'm so mindful of the students that I work with, they know me, right? And I know them, and I get to build a relationship. But I was previously an academic advisor, and I feel like for a huge chunk of the students that I saw there, I was the only advisor that they probably would ever speak to, not just in the year, right? Maybe in their degree, they would not build all these different advising relationships. So I think that it is kind of letting it happen and then kind of getting it to the right place, getting that person to the right place, and getting yourself to the right place to recover from it a little bit sometimes.
The topic of oversharing, if I could say one more. Oh, sorry, Jolie. Do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I was just going to say, sometimes I worry that, like, I wonder why a student is sharing that story with me, right? Are they sharing it because they think they have to, or they think it because of their own trauma and they don't have boundaries, or, they just start talking and then they just start this, deluge of information because of the impact of the trauma on themselves. So I worry that the impact longstanding is that they don't have necessarily control over who they're sharing their story with. And maybe they don't want to share it with me, but they just have. And then at the end of the conversation, they're upset, or the next week, they're very upset that they've shared this very, very personal information with me, someone they don't know that well. And it was unnecessary. So that's why sometimes I do interrupt students, and I will stop them and say, I want you do not have to provide me with more information. You don't have to share all this very personal information with me. I believe you. I trust you. I'll support you with academic concessions, with making good referrals. I can support you with any of those processes, but you don't have to share all of this, very personal information with me. If you want to tell your story and you feel comfortable with, and you feel like you need to tell your story to me, that's okay. And I'm okay with that. But I want the student to know that it's very okay for them not to fully go into all this detail, to share all this information. And that's fine. And that's their right. And they don't have to share that detail with anyone at the university, right? It's none of our business. Our business is to support students and to support them with their academic concessions, financial resources, whatever we can help them with, and believe them. So I think those are important things to really be very straightforward with students about, so that they know that they do have some agency and they can say no, and they don't have to provide all of this intimate detail about their own personal life to get their needs met.
Great. Adam, did you?
Just flipping the script a little bit about oversharing, and I do think it can work both ways. Advisors can overshare with students, and I always think about like a really good counseling session where you literally will probably not learn anything about your counselor, but you leave that session having learned more about yourself and feeling great. And I think as advisors, again, so many of us are empathetic and caring and lovely people. We want to connect with students. And when they disclose something, it's really tempting to say, oh, I'm just like you, or I have that same problem, or I went through the same thing. And that can be a slippery slope because, again, there are those power structures where you are not on the same level as a student. You represent a faculty or a unit. And I find myself often thinking, do I share this or do I bite my tongue? And more often than not, at the end of the day, I'm better off for having bit my tongue and just letting the students tell me their own story rather than interjecting my own experience.
That's a great point. Thank you. Does anyone else want to chime in on that, or I've got another question I can ask.
Yeah, I like that, Adam, you brought that point up, because a question I like to ask myself, if there's ever self-disclosure, it's often the question is, whose need is that meeting? is that benefiting me, or because I could say, oh, you think what you're going through is bad. Well, let me tell you what I went through. No, like if it's going to be something to share, it's to share our humanity and share that, or try to normalize something, and it doesn't have to be this deep, dark secret. It can be over the phone with a student that just got declined from UBC. And I would say, hey, that I know that's really tough, and I went through the same thing, but you know what? There are so many pathways out there, and then I start selling the pathway to UBC instead, and and it could just be that, and it's not for me. It's just meant to hopefully benefit the student in some way.
Great. Okay, so this next question is a little different, and but a good one, and one I'm sure that you've all come across. So this is from Andrea Yan, and Andrea asks, how do you manage and maintain those healthy boundaries and as an advisor if other faculty staff members within a unit would set different expectations or different boundaries? So I'll just let whoever feels the might want to take a minute to think. Jolie?
Yeah, I just always say what my boundaries are, and I can't control everyone, right? So I just say, like, I don't answer emails after 4:30. I don't work on the weekends. I don't answer the phone after work hours. Like, those are my boundaries, and I'm comfortable with that. And that's because I know the work will always be there. My background is social work. I've been a social worker for 25 years, and I want to continue in this work. I have to set and maintain those healthy boundaries for myself. And so I just say what I'm capable of doing and let other people do, what they feel is best for themselves. But it can be challenging when you see your coworkers, or you feel that pressure if coworkers are answering emails in the evenings or on weekends, and you wonder, oh, am I doing the right thing? Or, am I doing my job properly?
I do think within a unit, it's healthy to have discussions about harmonizing your approach to how you're dealing with students. And I think that's something that is difficult work, and it takes a lot of discussion and, kicking up the leaves and having really tough chats with one another. But between units, and I think Andrea's question, from what I understand, is like, how do you deal with students who have different expectations between units? And my approach is always just give them a very dry response, again, talking about cues and, the types of inquiries that you deal with. So I dealt with a student recently who said, this other office has a Zoom availability from 9 to 5 every day. Why are you only available for 1 hour a week? And just responding with a very matter-of-fact response, letting them know what your limits are and what your availability is, and leaving it at that. But then always going back to the point that I raised earlier about not throwing other units under the bus. So if you're a unit that's hyper, like Chris, if he is offering his cell phone to certain students, there's a reason for that. And of course, I know Chris would never, throw another unit under the bus for not having a cell phone connection with students. So, and hopefully forums like this help us all kind of, speak with one another more and have a community of practice where we can discuss this sort of stuff.
Thanks.
Yeah, and I think that like what I'm hearing it come down to is equity. I mean, if we all treated all students the same, that's not necessarily going to result in the same outcome for everybody. And so we all have different approaches because people have different needs and might need more support to have access to education at UBC. So that comes down to everything, even within the unit, even within different colleagues of who they're working with. I think that's really important to think about, is that, the students I'm working with have been, disproportionately excluded from education. And that's well documented, that's well researched, and I can justify and rationalize that. And if I had to explain it to another student, I wouldn't go into the detail, but I would vaguely explain, we all have different roles and responsibilities and deal with different types of work, and so it's not all the same. And I think it does really resonate with equity when I think about it.
I have nothing huge to add. These were good points.
Staring at your square.
Yeah, I think that point around equity is so important. And I think I do think that we need to be having those conversations in our units with our colleagues as well. And like, why are we either feeling pressured to keep up or to pull back? And I think in the pre-conversations that we had as a group, a lot came out around not wanting to cross a line that we wouldn't want to tell a colleague, right? Like we don't want to keep secrets in our work, but you're so right, like that we are talking about equity, right? And we are all striving for that and working towards that. And in service of that, some of our roles are necessarily a bit more porous than others, I think.
Andrea says, thank you very much for that. And I'm sure everyone feels the same. Another question, and it's sort of what you were just saying there, Sarah, is that, that time where you've crossed a boundary to the point where you almost don't want to tell your colleagues you've done it. What are some signs that you or someone might need to reset or redefine a boundary? And how would you actually go about doing that if you know that you needed to reset? Who wants to start off that one?
Yeah, I can jump in. I think, there's a feeling, it's quite visceral for me. If I start feeling uncomfortable, or if it's starting to not sit well with me anymore. And I do have an example, and it was navigating a friendship with a student, because in the youth and care community, it's really small. And this was never one of my students, but they ended up becoming my student after they were my friend, because we had been in volunteering together. So we were already Facebook friends. And lo and behold, they are also a former youth and care, and became an unclassified student, and then started asking me, really complex questions on Facebook. Well, it started simple, and I thought, okay, that's okay. And then it started being on weekends, and then it started being about student loans. And the student loan question is what crossed the line. I was just like, no, this is a weekend. This is my Facebook, and I want you to start emailing me. And of course, I did it gently. I was just like, I owned it for setting the tone in the beginning by, being okay with it in the beginning. And of course, that's a mixed message. So I owned it, and I said, now I do want to draw back, and I do want to honor my time off. And I asked that you support that, please. And they were like, oh, yeah, sorry, I didn't realize. So it was a complicated situation where, and I think we've talked about this, but once you let the boundary loose, it's really hard to tighten it up. So it's good to just keep it tight and loosen it over time to prevent those situations. But definitely they're not static. Boundaries can evolve, and they can go loose, and they can go tight again. It's harder one way over the other, but it can be done.
Thank you. Anyone want to add to that? Joey?
I just want to say, I think Chris really explained it well, just being authentic, right? And it's okay to say, I made a mistake, and owning that and saying, I made a mistake. I, didn't realize what was going to happen, or, I overstepped, or I overshared, or, but I really do need to, restart this relationship, or make sure that, you understand where my boundaries are. And I think that's just being authentic and honest. And you can do that in a friendly, nice way, right? It doesn't mean that you're a bad person or the other person is bad or wrong, right? It's just, it's a part of that gray area, or that movement of boundaries, and just being able to have those honest conversations with people.
Great.
Or just delete your Facebook. That's
Change your name, change your identity.
I think for myself, a sign that a boundary is being crossed is always when I'm having some sort of emotional response at work. You shouldn't be having endless emotional responses at work. Work should be work, but when you do feel flustered, something is happening, and more often than not, it's a boundary that's been crossed. So when I get that response from a student, it's often because I could feel angry because they're asking for something they shouldn't be asking. And if I see that there's a pattern happening, I'll just call the student on it and say, I'm concerned about this potentially becoming a pattern, whatever it is. Do you want to talk about it? oftentimes that question is a good entry point for them to explain what's been happening. And in terms of a reset, so with a very tangible example, if a student, for example, has anxiety about giving group presentations and throughout their entire university career, they've avoided group presentations, that could be a great opportunity to try to reset that boundary and let them know, hey, this is really important for you to practice. Is there anything we can do to support you? Let's see if we can get you connected to any kind of support systems on campus, because this is a skill that could really help you in life. And I had helped a student recently with that issue, and they were like, thank you so much for helping me. It's easy to try to get away from something that's uncomfortable, but I find I feel very rewarded when I help students cross a boundary that they've set for themselves. So when they're like telling themselves, I can't do this, I can't do calculus, I can't do this major, I can't do that. The greatest kind of experiences I've had with students is when I help them get past that. They'll always come back and thank me for that, versus the situations where I give them a parachute and help them get out of something that they feel they can't do. So
Yeah, the magic parachute.
yeah.
Sarah, did you want to add?
Yeah, I think for me, it's partly investigating, at least personally, or if I'm talking to a colleague who I also see like, oh, like what's happening here. Usually it's investigating, why am I in that space, right? What's gotten me there? And I think, Adam, you're right about emotional response and all of those pieces, right? So for me, usually the signs that I'm going to cross a boundary are either that there's a systemic failure that I just want to kind of fight against, or that I'm burnt out, right? And that's usually when it all kind of gets a little loose in my head sometimes, right? Where you're just like, oh, like, is this too much? Or am I doing too much? Or am I assuming that I should be doing things that I don't need to do? And I think that's a really important thing, to have colleagues that you trust, that you can have those conversations with, and that will and maybe that will initiate them, right? That I think in our work team, we're able to sort of share what we're doing, but also to talk to each other one-on-one to be like, are you doing okay? Like, is everything all right? Or what do you need? Or how can I support you in that case? And I think debriefing cases is really a big part of my practice and helps so much in kind of holding on to humanity when I'm drawing a line, right? Of feeling like it's okay to draw this line, right? And then I think I agree completely with Julie about those really honest conversations of just being able to be like, well, like, can we reset, right? And I think that that's okay, right? We're in the end supporting adults, right? And we're having these adult conversations, and it seems to me perfectly reasonable just to say, like, I need to reset, right? Or you need to reset, or we need to change our expectations of, why do you assume I can do this? Or what did I do to prompt this thought, right?
Yeah. There's a question from Sharon Badku, and says, how do you handle or prevent yourself from feeling guilty for not being able to help a student solve their problem in order to protect your own boundary? I think you're kind of going there, Sarah. I just want that conversation to keep going.
I mean, I love that question a lot. I think for me, it's partly experience, right? I think that maybe when I was a younger advisor or more, less experienced in my career, I think I carried a lot of guilt of like feeling like, well, I'm not a good enough advisor if every person that I have a conversation with isn't the most successful version of themselves or isn't the most fulfilled version of themselves. And I think that's a lot of ego, if I'm honest. For me, it was, right? And so I think letting that go. And then also, I think it's really asking, like, am I supporting you in developing the tools that you need for this? And I don't need to solve your problem, right? Like, I need you to solve your problem, and I need to be able to help you do that. But then also remembering, like, it's not our job to solve anybody's problem, even though it feels like it, right? It absolutely feels like that every day, right? Of, if I could just fix this, right? But I can't do that, right? So I think letting that go, and I think guilt is the most prevalent and unhealthy emotion that we carry as advisors, personally, I think.
Thank you. Seeing lots of nodding heads. Chris, do you want to chime in?
Sure. Yeah. Just to echo Sarah's point, I do think that, yeah, guilt, that definitely interferes with boundaries, but just recognizing that the assumption that that's coming from is that you are responsible for everybody's feelings and emotions and problems, which is not, yeah, which is false. It's not true. So yeah, I can see how that's totally ego. And I think for me, like when I think about my role, it's to just make sure students are informed and they do the rest. They just need to be informed of their options and maybe the outcome of each option. But really, as an advisor, I'm just informing them of each pathway, what might be the pros and cons of each of those, and then the rest is up to them. And that, I think, is crucial to and conducive to their own agency. And that's what we want to encourage, their own agency. Otherwise, we might be being a little paternalistic, and that can be disempowering, and that can actually foster dependence. And that's a disservice to students if they, leave UBC maybe more dependent than they were before. I think when I think about our role, it is to encourage students to have the tools and confidence to be able to manage some of those things on their own, not abandon them. That's different than apathy.
Many years ago, I was training for a new job, and a student called in asking for our help in filling out their entire student loan application. The person I was shadowing had been in the role for many years, and just without any emotional response, let the student know, quote unquote, that's not a service we provide. You're responsible for filling that out on your own. The conversation ended, and I was just awestruck because I was like, how could you not have helped that student? And it was one of those moments in my career where it became clear that had you helped that student complete this legal document, financial document with the government of Canada, you're kind of taking away their own agency. It's important that they understand the financial and legal obligations they're making with this document. So that was just one of those aha moments in my career where I realized, it is okay to let a student say that a certain thing is not a service that you can provide. And if anything, I actually think it's really in their best interest to be totally upfront and transparent about that sort of stuff.
Yeah, see, I would help them with the student loan application. I wouldn't do it for them though, but yeah. I would, they would share their screen and they're typing, and I might guide them through it. I share their screen. See, that's how in the thick of this Zoom world we're in. But yeah, I would definitely, the first time around, maybe guide them through things like that and offer it, but definitely erring on the side of their agency the entire time. And if they need that service, it's there within the parameters of, you're doing the work, but I'm there in your corner and guiding you through it, not doing it for you.
Yeah, and boundaries for me, I find them actually very fulfilling when you cross them once in a while. So I've met students in lineup at Starbucks on campus, and I'll have a 5 to 10 minute chat with them, not about their academics, but just about life, how everything's going. And so that's outside my professional boundary, but I know I had those sorts of chats with staff members or faculty when I was young, and having that sort of impromptu support is something that I always remembered. So sometimes crossing boundaries is important as well.
Jolie, did you want to have the final word on this one?
Now I've forgotten what I was going to say. Because I was listening to Chris and then, about the student loans. I was like, yeah, like my answer would be, it depends, right? Like some students I'd be like, no, like you can go and complete the student loan by yourself. Like that's not my role. But other students I might go through and say, okay, fill out this section, and explain explicitly what to do. But again, recognizing where students are at and how in my role, how their disability may impact their ability to understand the form, or how long it might take them, right? Like if it's taking someone, 4 times the amount of time that it would take, somebody else to complete an application form, then I might help them with it to, just make it a little bit easier. But really recognizing that, are not responsible for students' lives, right? Students are experts on their own lives. It's their life to live. We're not here to make their life easier, to solve all their problems. Like, that is definitely not our role. It's the student's life to live. And if they fail at a UBC, that's okay, right? Like, they will go on and they will, have they'll do something else in a different path, and that's okay. And we're not here to make sure that everyone graduates from UBC or gets everything they want as well, right? That was my thing about student loans, but then we started talking about something else.
The guilty thing.
Yeah. So I would say, I still remember this. I met a student. I did an intake with this. No, I didn't do an intake. He was, passed on to me from another advisor, and I could tell, we met, and he didn't really, I could tell it didn't go well. Like, he didn't have a warm, fuzzy. I wasn't well liked during that meeting, and I'm like, well, that's okay. Not everything goes great. But then I ran into him in the student union building at Blue Chip, and we had like a 5-minute chat, and that changed, like, that shifted our whole relationship, and it's quite interesting. Yeah, just taking myself out of the office, right? Like, really shifted that whole relationship. Mm-hmm.
Great. All right. Well, believe it or not, we're at time. So just really on behalf of everyone that's here today, I don't know if you guys can do your little clap hands or however you want, but I do want to thank Adam and Jolie and Chris and Sarah. I learn every time you guys speak. I really admire just the thought and integrity and the authenticity that you bring to your roles as advisors, and always keeping that student's best interest at heart, keeping your own ego at check, all of the things that you shared today. Thank you so much for sharing it with the group that's been here. And thank you to everybody for coming. You'll get a little feedback survey link. We really encourage you to fill it out. Let us know what you thought of today's session, any ideas you have as well for other sessions, either on this topic or others. All right, so we're rolling credits here with the thank yous. So everyone have a great rest of your day, and thanks again for coming.